I'm so glad you're joining us here. Richard Bertman and myself, Christina Lanzl. You are part of a placemaking session here. I'm the co-chair, and I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to talk about the synergy of architecture and art, since Richard and I have been in dialogue for, well, about the book actually we've worked on for about 4 years, and it was officially released this summer. And we've been really in communication really for more than 10 years. I have a background in art history and fine arts, and so I would see the exhibitions around the greater Boston area, the one at the Watertown Art Center, the Arsenal Center for the Arts. I remember seeing the exhibition at the Cambridge Arts Association Gallery, the one here in the BSA building when it opened, and then there have been other exhibitions locally. And so I've been really drawn to the work for a very long time, and particularly to mechanical sculptures. That's sort of a specialty of mine, kinetic works, and I've published several essays and articles just on moving facades, also related kinetics moving to architecture. And so when we started this conversation, eventually we just came up with this idea, yes, let's write a book.
Well, it wasn't as simple as that, because I had written another book on the design process. In fact, I don't know if the BSA has it or not, but it's a book that takes one through all the steps of the design process. And the publisher of that book said it had been to my office where he saw some of my sculpture, and he said, I'd like to do a book on your sculpture. And he suggested a flip book. And so that was fine. I was very happy about that. But then I met you, and somehow you suggested it should be more than that. And that sounded good too. So we persuaded the publisher to publish a larger, more complete book. And I must say, it's, I read it today to sort of be able to remember all the things that I should say tonight. And it's really, it's a very good book. And Christina forced me to organize all my work. I've done this since I used to draw and paint, and then when I went to graduate school, I started to sculpt. I started to weld and sculpt. So that was in 1960. So I've been doing this work for a long time, so there's a lot of pieces. And she was able to force me to get them organized and to define when they were done, and wrote this book, and it really is so wonderful. It was wonderful to me because she was able to show how one part of my work led to me doing other work, and sort of tied it all together, and really also related it to what was happening in today in society and also to other artists. So it's really an amazing job, I must say.
Yes, writing a book is definitely a very long process. You start with an initial idea, with a concept, then you can actually come up with a table of contents pretty much before you even start writing. I mean, you have to have a sense of who's your audience, what's the topic, and of course for Richard, Richard has that really, he has a foot in both the art world and in architecture. I mean, for those of you who don't know, he's a co-founder of the very well-known firm in Boston, CPT Architects, by the acronym Childs, Bertman, Sequeira, so the B in CPT is the Bertman, and a firm that actually has world-renowned with offices in Abu Dhabi, on the West Coast. I think you have over 250 staff members, right? So, I mean, clearly, very successful architect. And so for me, that was also, really exciting opportunity to talk to an architect who's also an artist, because that's fairly unusual. And to actually, work consistently for 50 years, I mean, that's really the breadth of the work. And if you look at the table of contents here, you see, there's well, this kind of, this idea of synthesis of art and life, sculpture and architecture, but then also the different types of works that you've worked on over the years. Actually, originally was a sort of idea, actually drawing, things were coming from drawing and then turning drawing into three-dimensional objects with wires. They're beautiful portraits. We'll look at a couple of those, and then following the wire sculptures, pretty much, Richard started working with kinetic works. And actually, the wire sculptures kind of contain the kinetic element already because they're such light wires. So I mean, they're pretty much, if you just a wind, like a breath of wind or a breath will already make them move in space. And so in a way that actually came naturally. And then the sculptures originally were mostly actually mechanical sculptures, drawn with a hand crank, and then later, actually mostly with electrical motors. And we'll talk about a little bit, why you actually did that. And then, but you didn't stop there, right? I mean, you kept going, from always searching for this next new thing. And so wood carving became this next new frontier in your work. And so, I mean, I feel also there's, always sort of trying to find a new edge, from wire sketch, from bending wire to welding to carving wood. And then actually you've done some casting as well of resin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's all kind of trying to cover all of that. And then the other thing that always really attracted me to your work as well was the fact that your work has humor. It makes me laugh, it makes people smile. And to me, that's a really wonderful quality in art, because if you're going somewhere at the end of the day and you see the art in a gallery and you had a rough day, and well, there's somebody who just makes light of things, and that's really sort of one of the strengths. So that's like a separate chapter also because of that. And then of course it wouldn't be complete if you wanted to be serious about publishing a book on Richard's work if you really do need the inventory of the sculpture. So there's over 100, and they're all listed along with the bibliography.
And we're going to show you every single one. And so lock that door. Would you lock that door so they
Right. So here is actually, interestingly enough, so there were also these jumps too, right? I mean, there was like the outliers, as you could call them, right? So this sculpture, Rainmaker, here is actually the very first kinetic sculpture, and the date is 1985. Now, the reason why I mention this date is because many of the wire sculptures actually came later. But just to see the movement, the complexity of it.
We hope. Anyhow, I think there's a problem here.
No, it's in a loop. It's on a loop. So.
Yeah, but it keeps stopping.
Oh, I see. Yes. Well, that's part of the transmission. I think the Wi-Fi's not fast enough.
But if you think about, I was the principal in this building at the office for the beginning process, and that last sketch was first sketch of what we wanted to do, or what I wanted to do, to show two big sails and make this building like looking out on the water. So this was the first thing that we showed the city. And of course, it went through a lot of changes to what we have today, but it was very much more sculptural than architectural at that point.
Rich, why is it called Rainmaker?
Thank you. This is my wife.
Dan Sandy's joining us, but we're so wonderful to have her kind of knowledge and an in-depth kind of experience also working with this artist and sculptor and
well, it's called
architect.
Rainmaker. It's sort of a tongue-in-cheek piece on the myths that we feel are true. You know, people used to find water by using dowsing rods. They hold these rods and they walk around the land hoping to find where the water was, and the rods would dip. And that would, they'd know, oh, there's where the water is. And we have all these myths that we take seriously as truth. And so this was an attempt to make a machine that you could move around the land, and it would tell you where water was and create either rain or find water under the soil. And so there's a pump on it, and you could, I don't know if it shows, you could see it in that clip, but there's all this exaggeration about what needs to be done in order to make this myth come true.
Well, of course, a rainmaker also, in sort of business speak, is somebody who really knows how to close a deal, right? So that's also that sort of like that whole content too, and that's also that relationship. Someone who's working actively in the field of architecture and kind of working as a principal at a firm, having a lot of pressure. You have to be able to know how to close a deal, right? So there's your rainmaker right here in terms of the kind of transferred kind of meaning as well. But I mean, at the same time.
So does this have anything to do with Charles Sekeres?
Who's he?
What?
Who's he?
I don't know. I've heard.
What makes you say that, Victoria?
Nothing at all.
Okay. I mean, because there is a found object in it, right? Clearly there was some kind of a card originally, and I mean, in my building we've actually done these sort of open studios, kind of after-hours tours where we had a little card with, a little bar on it, basically. But that's not the purpose here. That's totally out of the context here. But what's interesting too is, just sort of the structural element. I mean, the way this is constructed, right? There's a roof in many ways, right? And then the structure itself is, it's a skeleton. And then, I mean, that's kind of also how architecture is designed, right? I mean, sort of, very orthogonal kind of elements that combine with some circular elements that are moving in this case, and that's part of that sort of connection where I feel, the architect kind of shows. But this one we were talking about, right, that this was the first, and the wire is actually rather slow, I apologize. So in a moment, the sail will pop up again. And so Richard explained to me when we were talking about the preparation for this evening that the original CDT rendering that basically won them the competition. The rainmaker, the deal maker kind of image is this, almost ship-like or sail-like kind of, two-panel, very slender, shining piece of sculpture. And so there's again a relationship, where it's not really architecture. I mean, if you looked at this as a piece of sculpture on a smaller scale, you could easily, put that in the gallery and say, this is a sculpture right there. But I mean, of course, then the market forces come in. And this is where the artist sort of has to let go of the kind of original dream and turn it into something that's actually, corresponding to what real estate business principles are, because that's what drives the architecture. And so, in many ways, I think that also shows, and we've had that conversation also over the years many times, that the fact that you're working in a studio as an artist gives you the opportunity to just be completely freed of the demands of the market, which absolutely you have to respond to when you're making the architecture, and you have to pretty much be able to please your client in order to be able to successfully produce architecture.
I think as you go, I'm trying to think, what's the similarity between doing sculpture and doing architecture? And, I'm not sure there is a lot, but
I disagree, clearly.
no, I know. But because the scale is completely different. In one case, you're dealing with space, and with sculpture, you deal more with mass. Most sculpture is taking stone or clay or wood and carving away at it. And it's different, whereas in architecture, you're really creating spaces that then you enclose. And that starts to generate the form of what you're doing. And so, in fact, a lot of this work that you'll see is wire, because I drew a lot. And I found that I could draw in space three-dimensionally. And I was thinking about it, and in a way it's, as an architect comes to sculpture, it is more like creating spaces. If you see, it's like you draw the structure, and then the space that's created within that structure is almost like when you're designing and you're creating spaces, and then you're enclosing. So, oh yeah, so, well, even this one's, that's, well, I'll get to that later. So this is my studio, and it's a mess.
Oh, it's creative, yes. But I mean, you can see clearly the welding equipment, right? You have the gas tank right here, and then there's the exhaust back here. So this is where a lot of creative work actually happens. And then some drill presses and saws, and then yes, you want to be able to study anatomy. So there's a skeleton in the studio, a very typical setup. There's always some trash or things you can pick from and pick through if you needed to pick up some parts. So it's all very functional. It's a beautiful space.
So if anybody wants to learn how to weld, does anybody know how to weld?
No, never tried.
Well, you can come to my studio, I'll teach you about 50 inches.
Okay.
But I mean, I think that's also what happened, you know, in terms of the 50-year, you know, kind of time period of working in the studio. I mean, there were times when Richard, particularly when it was, you know, building up the firm, and, you know, clearly you have 3 children, so, you know, there were a couple of years when there was very little production in the studio. But then once you actually ended up putting your own studio, and that's the one that you have been in for 40 years, right? That's really where you can be productive. But so and then of course, you know, the other thing that of course happens because you've been working in private, a lot of the sculpture actually have these private themes. So here, you know, the Sunday stroll, right? It's a family outing. A lot of the work you produce actually has to do with family, with friends. It's very personal, and that's part of the charm actually to me. So Sunday stroll, of course, has some really famous press, and actually, yes, with the family dog, right? That's the you know, this right here. So always having everybody in the family right in the mix, and then, you know, well, pram here with you know, carting around the children when they're little. But there's a beautiful precedent sort of the, you know, kind of Sunday outing, right? And that sort of also kind of brings me to placemaking, because I mean, this is Georges Seurat, and he was one of the leading pointillism artists from Paris and France. And so he did a scene of this island, Sunday afternoon, I don't know, La Grande Chatte. But this is also, you know, this island particularly actually has been painted by probably hundreds of artists. I mean, there's some really famous experts, like this is another one by Vincent van Gogh, the bridge that leads over to this island. So this is, La Jatte is basically a large island in the Seine in Paris. And it was originally privately owned, and then in the 1880s, it was actually more publicly accessible, and it was an instant success. Like one of the Napoleon rulers of France, together with Baron Haussmann, who was a famous urban planner in Paris or in France, they actually kind of, you know, designed it, made it accessible to the public. And then there's this famous little pavilion, which was originally actually dedicated to the god of war, Mars. And then, you know, part of that transformation was to actually turn it into the temple of love, like the temple de l'amour, right? So, you know, it becomes this, like, you know, this location for trysts and for lovers to meet and to celebrate love. And so, I mean, so ultimately, to me, you know, what Haussmann and Napoleon were doing, this is a placemaking opportunity, and they completely, you know, it was an instant success with many people spending their Sunday on the island, enjoying the fresh air, bringing their families, and so I mean, I think all of that is contained in your work as well, you know, in the family outing, because it sort of referenced that, you know, spending time together, being active, being outdoors, and interacting with other people, with your neighbors perhaps you meet around on your walks. So that sort of is another element that's always wonderful to kind of observe when you look at the work. So these are some very, very early sculptures from '65, right, while you were still a student.
Well, just going back to this, because I think what I love about reading this book is what Christina brings to it. So it's all this history and connections to, because the island was, that Seurat painting was what inspired me to do that piece. So it was really nice to learn about all this history that went into that, because I was not aware of those things. You know, so these are early works. The one on the left was really learning how to weld. So I was taking rod, this was at graduate school, taking rod and then learning how to connect things. And you know, you have to heat the metal until it melts, and you want to make a neat joint. And so every time one piece of metal joins another was a learning experience in terms of how to learn how to do this. So I did this piece, and then that's great, and I threw it in the trash. And the professor, I was walking around the campus, this was in Berkeley, and someone came up to me and said, "Hey, I saw your piece in the museum." So the professor had taken it out of the museum, taken it out of the trash and put it in the museum. So that was such an encouragement to my thinking, gee, maybe I can do something with this sculpture, it seems good. But the problem is that welding, you don't have a mass. It's not like you have a big stone that you can start carving away. And that's what I was talking about. With welding, it's adding, it's all adding. This is what we call cityscape, which is, you know, it's only about this big, but I keep imagining if it were, you know, 3 stories high, that would be great. So if you know anyone who wants to build a big cityscape model like this, 3 stories high, let me know.
But I think, I mean, immediately, you know, there is that relationship between sculpture and architecture, right? I mean, it's a cityscape, so that's a theme for an architect. And then the size of it, you know, if you look at it from an architect's point of view, they have the size of maquettes, right? This is what you design before you actually execute the real size architecture. And so again, you know, to me, I mean, they can both serve as architectural models, but they're also sculptures in their own rights. And so that's where I feel that synergy happens again as well. And I do like these two in comparison, because as you were saying, you have these sort of drawings, you know, drawing of line and space, or, you know, pretty much also like architectural renderings again, these panels that are being, you know, assembled in different planes. And then on the right-hand side, yes, I mean, this sort of, you know, this kind of challenge to yourself, okay, let's try to actually take these small parts and then condense them in a fashion so they really turn into, well, mass or buildings, if you want to read them again, as architecture. And what I like about them too, you know, they're very, you can see that they're clearly done by a beginning welder, so they have these really sort of, you know, very rough marks. But to me, that's actually part of the strength or part of the beauty of the work.
Yeah, but you could see that as a facade that you know, so the compositional needs are the same in sculpture as in architecture.
Yeah. And then, so here's another example. A couple years later, the trophy's on the right? The cow skull though from '56. So, well, Richard really has a very, well, thorough education. I mean, he actually has his initial Bachelor of Fine Arts from Harvard University, so you really learned how to draw, you know, figurative drawing, right? So you're a classically trained artist, as a matter of fact. In addition to then, after finishing Harvard, moving on to MIT to get another Bachelor in Architecture. So you really have like both, you literally have both educations, right? And then after that, you just mentioned Berkeley. Berkeley was actually the university where Richard then actually obtained his master's degree. But you know, if you look at 20-year difference, you know, you see this opportunity here on the left to really try to render space and show shadow. So it's a 2-dimensional drawing on paper, and then taking that idea of the head and turning it into a sculpture that's actually made out of thousands of little parts, because all these little welded plaques or plates you see, they're no more than maybe, how large are they? Couple of inches, right? So they're tiny. So this is a labor of love, right? This is obsessive what you're doing here, clearly, right? And it's also really fun because there are different materials, like there's copper, then there's steel. You know, right?
But it was, again, trying to find a way of
rose.
making mass and form. So, you know, I tried taking a lot of pieces of rod and little pieces of metal and welding them together to do some things, but they couldn't really create form. And then I started to think, well, maybe I can use sheet metal, sort of big enough so that I could start to form the circles or the curves that I wanted in the piece. And that's what resulted here. That was just very difficult and time consuming.
And then again, this whole other little layer with the type benign trophy, right? I mean, this is a made trophy, right? So it's the idea that, well, you're not a hunter. It's also a statement about, perhaps, well, not hunting animals, right? You can always use the sculpture and hang that up in your living room.
My wife teaches about death and dying, so I keep saying that what I want to do is have myself frozen and stuck on the wall when I die. Like they
Okay.
That's a deal.
These are some of these, and these, so from the small scale work, and actually the moose is more or less pretty much life size. These are also life size, right? But you're moving from about 2 feet now to 6, 7 feet in height. And they look like drawings here in the photographs, but these are 3-dimensional sculptures. You can walk around them. Everything is well, taking the essentials of the human body and turning them into portraits pretty much.
So these are more like new approach. This is what I was saying about you make the structure. The woman, you make the structure of the body, and then it creates this space inside, which is the form. So that, and I always loved to draw, so there was a lot of learning that went into how to do this. Because when you draw on paper, you don't have to worry about weight or gravity or any of those things. But when you draw in space, you got to structure this thing so it doesn't collapse or doesn't move the way you don't want it to move, or express something that you don't want. In order to hold it in place, you either have to add a piece to it, and unfortunately, in 3 dimensions, that piece becomes a line. So it expresses something in what you're trying to express that you don't really want if it's just a piece of metal holding something up. So you really start to learn the quality of what the material is you're working with.
And so just some other examples of why I sculpture, so you really became comfortable working with the human figure ultimately, right? And then the next kind of endeavor after being able to really work from the figure, and actually that's another thing I like to think about, the woman as object or the waiting to cross. Again, they're very personal. Richard, he tells me, used to ride his bicycle from Newton to his office downtown, and this is just something he would do every day, right? Or woman as object. This is sort of the conversation of feminism happening in the 70s and 80s. And then taking that one step further is really try to actually endow the figures or the sculptures with features that are actually really likenesses. And so Sandy's on the left, and it's her hair. He's done several portraits of her. And then on the right, actually, Sandy and David Buckler, who are personal friends of yours, and of course they're also known as really great philanthropists for the arts in Boston. And often they were gifts for those folks for birthdays and special occasions.
And he has worked. He was an industrialist, if anybody knows David Buckler. Made a lot of money, and I don't know, for some reason he likes my work, but so he commissioned me to do several pieces, one this and his wife, and he has some pieces at MIT.
There's one just outside the Federal Reserve Bank, actually, right next door, the large bronze disc. That's also David Buckler, and he has another work over at Mass Art near the Sculpture Garden. Some more friends and portraits. Robert Campbell, the architecture critic. Here's your relationship to architecture again. Bruce Peel, he's actually known for always wearing a bow tie, so that's kind of a characteristic here. And I recognize these folks by looking at these portraits, I really do. And so I think that's an incredible skill, particularly if you think about how little there is in terms of actual wire, right? So it's an amazing level of abstraction that actually takes place here.
It's hard to photograph because you're seeing the back and the front at the same time. But I think that it turned out that was something that I really liked about he's drawing in space, because it's hard to tell when you're looking at it which pieces are in front and which are back. So as you move around the piece, the relationship of the middle lines change, and it adds a vitality to it.
And so talking about portraits or faces, right? So that's sort of, just got me thinking. So somebody else I've written about, or I have written published an essay on kinetic facades. And so, trying to, in my mind, establish the connection between architecture or faces. You can turn faces into wall-size animations, right? And so there's this kinetic element again. So I'm just going to play this video back to you. So this is, as it says here on the ID, a Megaphone Pavilion, which was designed by Asif Khan. He's an architect, brilliant, from London. And he was working with a Swiss engineering firm, iArt, who actually did what's called the actuators, and really makes that piece move. But the video actually tells the story, so I'll just play this.
For thousands of years, people have used faces to tell stories. From portrait painting to emoticons of the present day, faces have always been a shorthand for communication. For the Sochi 2014 Winter Olympic Games, Megaphone launched the campaign Create Your Own Olympic History. It encouraged people to make the Olympics a very personal experience with social networks and Megaphone's mobile internet. Megaface's Olympic Pavilion became the perfect culmination to the campaign. Its unique innovation was inspired by the notion of the selfie as a universal tool for communication in the digital age. And it became so much more. With the help of the world's first three-dimensionally actuated large-scale LED screen, thousands of people had a chance to create their own history of the games. The kinetic facade of the pavilion is formed of 11,000 actuators. Each actuator carried their tip a translucent sphere that contains an RGB LED light. Each actuator acts as one pixel within the entire facade. It extends up to 2 meters to transform the surface in 3 dimensions. The resulting portraits appear on the side of the building as big as 8 by 6 meters, a magnification of 3,500%. To create a selfie, the visitors simply scan their faces in one of the 7 instant 3D photo booths inside of the pavilion. The booths also travel to 30 cities in Russia to let everyone become the face of the Olympics. And live online video stream at the facade with the link to the personalized 20-second video made sure that no face will be missed. The ultimate selfie was hard not to notice. Epic, innovative. The Megafaces Pavilion took social media by storm, and worldwide television and press coverage resulted in over $12 million on earned media. With Megaphone being the most talked about Olympic partner of the Games.
That's something that really makes places.
I think so. And the fact that people were able to directly participate in creating their own environment, that's really brilliant. And so, unfortunately, this is a little slower than it should be. This is Richard's sculpture Icarus. Does everybody know the story of Icarus? Yes, right? And also, if the date again, 1990s, right? Something like the Sochi Olympics Games wouldn't have been possible in those days. Sorry, I'm ahead of myself now. And, but the reason why this image is actually popping up is because if you look at Icarus, I see cantilevers, right? And so, looking at the ICA building, for instance, there's a giant cantilever, and I think part of what you do, even if it's just subconscious, you just process all this information that is mutually inspiring, whether it's the architecture or the art. I don't know where one ends or the other one begins, but I think there are these synergies. And I mean, and if nothing else, each building has mechanicals, right? There are moving parts in the buildings, and for you to actually understand that and how that works is something that just adds another layer of craftsmanship in general, whether it's your architecture or your sculpture.
But in terms of the connection, what you're saying is I do have the sense of where the wire hits the rod to make the wing kind of vibrate, even though you can't tell it on this system. Where's the PSA? The system is not very good that relates this to that. But anyhow, but in terms of actual connections, it's hard to make that between sculpture and architecture. There's one piece where I use diagonals in order to strengthen the structure. So because I know it from architecture, for example, that's two-story piece probably is a big grid of steel behind that allows the cantilever. You can't do that.
I want to see those arms. So that's something. Anne Sussman is an architect who actually has been sort of doing research on the sort of expressive qualities of architecture and how the human, basically our brains are wired to see faces. That's a very basic kind of recent connection between actually architecture and medicine. So that's actually, she just wrote a book about that as well. And so there are these sort of human features that are actually containing buildings, whether we want it or not. Or the fact that people who see those buildings that have these sort of human features respond to them more genially, or more, if they embrace them more easily than something that doesn't have that quality. So that's, that is scientific evidence. Go
What's
ahead.
your name again?
Anne Sussman, Sussman. Then, human figure is actually something that you've been working on, you were working on for a long time, right? And but also, as you saw in Icarus, there's still this figure, but then there are also abstract work. So both of those things actually are kind of running parallel in your work. So we'll just look at how this moves.
And this is wood, so I started to do wood carving. I think there are some other pictures. So if you're ever interested in seeing how the pieces move, on my website, which is richardbertman.com, there's clips that show how each piece moves and what it does. This is a little static, unfortunately.
But what's remarkable is just the quality of the complexity. The works are becoming more and more complex because all these moving parts. There's a camshaft that's actually part of the sculpture that's installed behind the piece. Where it almost looks like a thumb piano. All these different levers, and you can really see how every single part is actually moving. You can physically observe the mechanics of the sculpture. And I thought always as well that was something really wonderful to really be able to see both. Some of the later sculptures have sort of hidden these things, but with these large-scale ones, and also trying this out at human scale, right? The full-size human figure.
And I asked myself, why do I enjoy doing this? What is it about it? And it's I think it's like exploration. You have an idea when you start. This is, I suppose, similar to architectural design. You have an idea. and then you start to make it and you realize this really isn't gonna work. You know, I can't do what I wanna do. And so you get to a point where you start to improvise and do things at the time. You know, you add something, you do something to it, and then suddenly there's a eureka moment and you say, wow, that's pretty interesting. It's like finding something. It's like exploring and, you know, hey, look at that, that's pretty good. And then you take it from there and you go another step and the same thing happens. And I think that's what the enjoyment you get out of doing this kind of work. And each one, as I learned, each one got more and more complicated.
Is it also about freedom?
Rhythm?
Freedom.
Freedom. Well, it's freedom, yeah, you're much more free than you are as an architect. And you don't have the liability that you have to worry about.
Client, no city hall, no.
Yeah, it's true. I keep thinking, how is anyone in the future, when someone has is going to fix it? You know, there's so many subtle things going on here, just to make the cogs in that wheel connect when it frees up. You can see the second if it goes as far. That red sail falls, and then you have the cog has to rejoin the rest of the sculpture, and you know there's a string that pulls down to get this mechanism that wants these two pieces to connect. That runs down and gets this one in a certain position so it's ready to accept this one that's turning, but it's not quite exact, and then there's a little thing that makes that connection so it joins the two. It becomes a huge puzzle, some of these moving pieces.
Right, and then that's part of, again, the fascination, right?
Yeah.
To know that there's a lot of complexity here, and it's wonderful to see it work, but you know, unless you really work with this material, you don't really understand it. And the title, of course, Searching for Leonardo, is connecting with Leonardo da Vinci. And if you make kinetic sculpture in a way, you know, it's almost like you have to be connected back to Leonardo da Vinci because he's the one who, well, really kind of rebirthed the dream of flying for humanity during the Renaissance, and it took another 500 years to actually get to the point of doing it, or 450, however long, which, you know, that's just incredible, right? And then we just saw Icarus, the original story from Greek mythology, which dates back to 2500 BCE. So I mean, the dream of flying clearly is a long endeavor on people's minds, and for Leonardo da Vinci, I mean, conceptually, he had actually solved the problem, right? I mean, he knew you need to have bird wings, and just like in the Icarus legend or mythology, there has to be a way of connecting them to the body, and then you fly, right? And I mean, he solved the problem by constructing these elements, clearly showing how it needs to be done. And here's another work I feel is a really fun element in this conversation, because the sculpture you see on the right is actually a preliminary to the final Leonardo. So you still see these copper pipes, but ultimately it's just one half of the wing, right? And so the next iteration became the sculpture. So this is an early version of the Leonardo, and you took the light bulb away. You usually can explain much better than I can.
Well, that's, you said it. I took the light bulb away. One of the things that is good about, I've never really wanted to sell my work because I was making money as an architect. I didn't need that, and I really put so much into it. I really liked having them around, so I just kept most of them. And that gives me an opportunity to walk around and say, gee, you know, that would be nice if I did that, and then I do that later on, and these things evolve.
and then they turn into some even larger objects like this one here. So this is a very recent work actually, 2017, just finished. And well, I'm looking at this and think this is a giant piece of architecture, right? It's a windmill, it's a tower, all kinds of things move. Let's let this thing here move for a moment.
So, you saw the Grand Budapest Hotel.
Yes.
Anybody see the Grand Budapest
Yes.
Hotel? Yeah, it just had this wistfulness about it, like you wanted to go back. You almost remembered things. It was just a wonderful movie. Wonderful. He's a great filmmaker.
But I mean, look at this, right? I mean, there's vertical movement, there's horizontal movement, there's circular movement. I mean, it's amazing. And then the light too. That's another element. You're experiment. I mean, you're always experimenting with this next dimension, and so the lights are actually a way of also, for me again, to see how lighting works in architecture, right? And I brought it on an example again from this particular building, which always is a nice thing to say. Well, here's our case study, case in point. So we'll look at that in a moment. Look at that, right? So Lamb Partners actually is the lighting consultant for Atlantic Wharf. And so, you're doing the studio experimenting, whether it precedes or, the actual architecture or whether it comes later. Richard actually also worked on some very, very early sort of light in sculpture in the model for a floor lamp, which was actually made out of a robot. So it's been another sort of theme, or if the carpe diem, right, with the light bulb in it. So just trying things out, and they might not even become the final piece, right? But it's sort of experimenting, and I do feel, there's like this, intellectual exchange going on between what you do in your studio and then what's going on in practice as an architect as well. Here's another, tower, right? We just looked at the wistful memories, and clearly it's a tower, and this is another building by CBT Architects over on Huntington Avenue with this beautiful flecking pool of the Christian Science Center right in front of it. And again, the top of this building, that's also, I've always looked at this building thinking, this is, it's a crown or it's something, right? I mean, to me, there's sculpture on top of this building. So it's something else where the two elements are combined.
I could get into this. I could get into the Prudential Center and tell you all about the history of what happened to Prudential, but I won't. But
Well,
this
we have
was,
to talk about art, right? Oh.
yeah. Well, that building is. They wouldn't let us do a circular building, the Pru, because they didn't want all these offices having curved surfaces. So that building resulted in a whole series of straight lines, which made great corner offices. But the reason for that was that.
So it's ultimately multifaceted, almost like a diamond, right?
Yeah, but I mean,
So that the office architecture itself could have a flat exterior.
But it was really because of the closeness of these other high buildings. In order to create more open space between them, the building took that form that allowed more light and air to be between these high buildings.
Also looks better.
Yeah.
And again, this is a static kind of quality that I feel definitely, if you can, right, you've always tried to push for that edge in the architecture. Like the Oval building that's, in the Seaport, that's the latest CBT building in the Seaport, the Oval building. I don't know if you probably have been past it, maybe not even realizing it's a CBT building. But I mean, it does something else, right? It's not just a square box, like something else. And now we're getting to the wood. And still doing figures, another portrait. This was another gift or commission. It was a commission, actually, right? Yes, for the baccalaureates, and I mean, incredibly accomplished. Actually, before this work was made, Richard did a portrait of Sandy, his wife, and so which is less, finished than this one, right? But so ultimately, Sandy was the guinea pig for the finished, very traditional form actually. So, and then I actually just want to make that reference again. If you look at this figure, this is from Egypt. I could have picked the female figure as well. This one has actually it's on Wikimedia, Wiki Commons. So I was able to actually use it, but just so that like that whole idea of human form and this sort of really just very. This is a very stable composition of the body, right? There's no movement in it, which is interesting because actually later, or a lot of the murals in Egyptian art always have like this sort of element where one foot actually is set in front of the other, so it looks like the body's or the person's moving. So this is clear, just in terms of the expression, this is a person of both feet firmly planted on the ground, and but with beautiful expression, clearly a portrait, right? So, and compliments.
Well, the Egyptian figure, which I really liked that you found that, because it did show a more straight figure, but that sculptor, his next piece was much more animated. No, that's supposed to be a joke.
But it's also, it's hard to show movement, right? And that's also the difference between, in terms of if you're looking at in art historical periods, like the Baroque, for instance, right? In the Baroque, artists really tried to develop figures that showed movement as such. And so even the Renaissance, with like standing and sort of like the resting leg, which is something that goes back to classical antiquity, but there's also this other side where, we have this more just a firm, unmoving figure. And then here is another metamorphosis, unlike the other one, another wood sculpture. But look at this one.
So this one was just taking some pieces of wood, gluing them together into a big piece, and then carving that head, and then cutting it. And
Do you want to explain how it's actually made on the
so it's
below?
It's like a big jigsaw puzzle, and then below it there's a plate, just a plate that has bumps on it. So as that plate rotates, it pushes these little pieces of wood up and down, and it makes movement in the surface.
And so, we've talked about the sort of jigsaw puzzle type structure, but I'm looking at this face, and it's facing up. So I also see topography, and so again, all of a sudden, the face is not just a face anymore, but it's also a piece of landscape that just happens to have the shape of this face. And actually, many artists have painted very sensual kind of landscapes, where or even landscapes themselves, right? Have names that are named after women's bodies, and you see these shapes in the landscape, right? So, and then just kind of looking for comparison material. So I went to the CBT website, and well, there it is, right? So the topography, and then these kind of puzzle pieces that are actually showing up in this Abu Dhabi Education Center that was designed by a firm. And so I feel it's all there. The connection between the architecture and the sculpture, absolutely. And I, it's not necessarily you yourself, right, who does that, but clearly, I teach architectural history and placemaking at Wentworth, and my students are actually most excited about when they look at some really wonderful artifacts or art. And so I really feel that, even in terms of the architectural education, it's a very strong emphasis on shape. Of course, all parts of other parts of the education that I'm not really part of, but I know that my students really respond to beautiful form and strive for that.
In fact, that piece with the head was came out of the land. You know, it was inspired by Wyatt's Christmas Day, I guess it's called. You know, a woman sort of part of the land. I don't know if you've seen it, but it was quite beautiful, and it inspired me to do that piece.
And so that's kind of actually, so we're actually through the different types of work you've been working on, the wire sculptures, the kinetic works, and the wood sculptures, and these are just examples. Clearly there's a lot more work. And then now we just want to show some of the humorous works, and these are actually like sketches, right? I mean, this is how an architect would sketch. Again, these are three-dimensional, they're wire drawings, they're from the 1980s, so a lot of things were happening in parallel. But to me, these are really funny, actually, and they're tiny. I mean, you can put them on a shelf, and there they are, for your amusement. Then lots of things go in my head. I mean, if you see these, like, what comes to mind, right? Seeing a crocodile on the leash, your response. I mean, to me, my first reaction, oh, that's just like Isabella Stewart Gardner, like taking her leopard on the leash down Commonwealth Avenue Mall, right? I mean, that's like that whole idea. Or then, a Crocodile Dundee, right? I mean, there's all these associations that come to mind. And then the man in the shower, right? I mean, he looks like he's cold. He's like, bending down under that stream of water. And I mean, even trying to show water, right? I mean, that's, again, that's an intellectual challenge. How do I draw or sculpt water? And we talked about that, actually, right? How that was one of the things we were trying to accomplish here.
It's funny as you talk. What I see is, how am I going to make something have definition that's very small? And so this is working with pliers to see, can I make eyes that small with this wire, or do I need a different wire? It's a much more pragmatic
Practical kind of making, absolutely right. So that, clearly the maker is speaking. But I'm also seeing a figure in space, right? By the shower stall, this is the room this figure is in. So this relationship between the figure and the space around it, and trying to actually, create this, relationship and the figure in space. Ultimately, that's the subject here on that shower stall particularly. Oh, here's another fun one in terms of the humor piece.
We've been married for 60 years, by the way. So in each piece, I tried, as I was developing what I was doing, I was trying to make something add richness and interest to what I was doing. So, you have a piece, you add color, you add movement, you add noise or sound, you add voices. I mean, it was sort of an attempt to make something that would be more, have more interest to people, to keep them there involved longer.
Right, working with sound, and that's also something we introduced in several works. Actually, that's not the only one that actually has a recording with Richard's own voice. In this particular case, also with Sam's voice, and again, this impossibility for this couple to communicate. So, but in a very funny way, and also very poignant, though. I mean, very, very interesting. And then another family portrait here. Sunday stroll, made room for a family portrait where everybody's, the paterfamilias on the bottom there, with his tongue hanging out, clearly just really overwhelmed with his task. And then, you name the parts. It's your family.
So I had been to the Pacific Northwest and seen a lot of totems, and came back and did this. So it's, and most of the totems are of family, relatives of that particular person who did it. So this is me at the bottom, and that's Sandy. Next up.
With mascara,
She's actually better looking than that. And then,
Thank you.
And then believe it or not, that's my oldest son next, holding my daughter, who had a doll. And my son happened to just walk in. That's him.
Oh,
And that's my other son, who's the filmmaker, who some of you have seen what he did. And we had a dog, and my son had a snake. Did you want to talk about that snake, John?
Right. Well, then, on the right, just one last sort of humorous work with the flowers, and of course, there's a spider hanging down from the beautiful bouquet. Right. I think that's actually. Oh, that's one of my favorites. Yes. Love tennis.
I got a feeling.
You got a feeling? I could look at this for hours, right? And it keeps me going. It's just funny.
The nice part about this is you make the mechanism that makes something go backwards and forwards. And I don't know, you can't see it there,
I can go
but,
on.
and so everybody's supposed to be going backwards and forwards the same way because I have each one of these mechanisms working. And sometimes one isn't quite right. So you have by accident this nice quality to have it where some person's way, they've all gone that way and then that person moves.
They went to the ball boy.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is another one of those works, where you can clearly see how everything works, right? I mean, you can look below, you can see all the gears and how it all falls into place. And I like the fact that this is a mixed audience. And 2010, I think it was right around the time when Marina and Serena Williams were just really, winning all the international tennis tournaments. And so, I mean, clearly,
They
actually
still
that's
are,
something
aren't
else. Oh, well, yes, they are, yes. Well, starting to lose a few games, which is remarkable. I mean, that's another thing, really, you've always been inspired by, what's going on around you, or by pop culture. Like, for instance, The Bionic Man, there's the film, right? And the TV series on the Million Dollar Man, exactly, right? I mean, and then the whole conversation, bionics, right? I mean, that's when that conversation started. And now it's a huge, actually, field of study in itself. That's actually, popular. And you've always sort of been able to feel the pulse of the times we're walking through, and questioning things and commenting. So there are also a couple of pieces on like the Vietnam War, for instance, or the Holocaust, and so just things that make you think. So that's always kind of made me enjoy that conversation as well, because it's a starting point to have a dialogue. That's about all from us. Anything from you?
Bridget, of all the technique you have played with, experimented with, which one do you prefer? Which one amuse you most?
The one I'm doing now.
Of course, but which period was the most enjoyable?
They're all very similar.
I totally agree with you, Richard. I know that's exactly what it's like. It's like they're your children, your art.
Same
Whatever
process,
you make,
same.
it's your closest to what you actually are currently working on. It's usually that's what it is.
And it's different than architecture, where a lot of times the project you like best is one that turns out well, but where you have a very good client, you have someone who you really want to work with and who appreciates what you do. So I think in this case I always have one client. So it's a little different, that what makes it more enjoyable is just the process of doing it and learning and being successful and being able to do what
In
you
the
want to do.
freedom of it,
Yeah.
of improvising.
Yeah. And it's probably the same with everybody when they're trying to create something. And the process is very much the same. In this book that I wrote, it gets into the thinking process when you're designing something. So, and I find that, and so I was trying to get at, what is the design process? How do you think? And so I did a whole bunch of, I did a house, and I had all these sketches, and I documented what I was thinking with each sketch and kept a record of it. And then that became the basis for this book, because it explained how does it all work, how do you, all these things come together, and it's the same thing, you sort of, before you can decide on one thing, you have to go, because there's a problem with something else, and you can't solve that until you try to figure out, you try to track that graph all the way back to being able to solve that problem. Now you're closer to being able to solve the bigger problem. Then there's another thing that comes up, you have to solve that problem before you can really put it all together, you have to go through this whole problem-solving thing where you look at each thing that you have questions about, and finally you get it, you understand it, and then you can come up with a solution.
But there's something that I've noticed, and I think you have a quote in your other book about it, that, you know, I've lived with the frustrations that he's worked with, but then there's something about the process of making mistakes, but art is knowing which ones to keep. I mean, even what you were saying before,
Right.
there was something about, wow, there's something about a spontaneity that's exciting to you, and then you could build on that.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you that when Halloween, the kids come in for trick or treat, they come in, and of course Rich goes upstairs, and I start showing them the sculptures, and they come in, and then they bring their parents in, and to see their faces, the kids' faces, I mean, that's what interests me, that there's something about the excitement of how you're trying to solve the problems, and then there's the spontaneity and the humor. I can't explain it, but there's something reassuring to me about how kids respond to art, and
It's that quality that's so critical, isn't it? So that you're not you don't bring your own baggage. You look at something,
it's a
try to find what the
surprise,
essence
yeah.
is of that, and how children are able to do that. You know, they really see.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah.
definitely a good point as well. I mean, it's work that actually appeals to any age group, right? I mean, you don't have to be, you know, intellectual or scholar to really appreciate the work, and that's really, it's very accessible. So we brought some books, in case you want some. We will write a little dedication for you if you'd like to. Other than that, I'd say the bar is open. Have a slice of pizza. It's part of the hold at this point, but do help yourself. And thank you.
Thank you.